So welcome everybody. Let me make sure I am sharing the right screen here. Okay. So you guys are all here for Sumptuary Laws. So this is Sumptuary Laws, 600 to 1600, 1650-ish. I am Isobella Gray. I am in the barony of Donnershafen. There's my email if you want to jot it down real quick. Feel free to pop questions in the chat and I will try to get to those. This is going to be kind of an overview of what sumptuary laws are in this time frame. I am going to talk about individual countries, but it's going to be kind of a brief overview. So come on. Oh, here we go. All right, so because my mundane job, I have to put this slide in here. I am a nurse in my mundane profession, so I have to say I have no conflict of interest, meaning nobody is paying me any money to come and do this for you. This is all voluntary. That way, if it comes back to my mundane job, somebody can't, do anything weird. So we're going to talk about sumptuary laws in what we define as the SCA period. I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-period and post-period. Not a lot, just because we want to stick to where we are. I got interested in this because my friend who got me into the SCA and I were having a conversation and we got talking about sumptuary laws, and then I ended up buying a book, and then that led to another book, and that led to, oh, you should write an article for the Complete Anachronist. So then that led to, oh, you should teach a class. So that's kind of how that progression has gone. I am just about done with the article for the Complete Anachronist, so that you guys will see that soon. So there's going to be things there that aren't in the PowerPoint, because I also had to whittle that down a little, or we could be here the rest of the afternoon. So what are sumptuary laws? So if you go to the dictionary, it's going to give you a definition, right? And it's a law common in the 13th to 15th centuries to prevent extravagance in private life by limiting expenditures on food, clothing, and furniture. So basically what people could buy. It's also a law designed to regulate habits, primarily based on moral or religious reasons, but regarded and justified by the police powers of the state. And this is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary online. But as we talk over the next about hour, you're going to find that it goes a lot farther beyond just these couple lines from Mr. Webster here. So the word sumptuous or sumptuary comes from the word sumptuous or sumptuarius, which is Latin in origin, meaning expense or cost. So some places you're going to read, if you're like, hey, this is super interesting and I want to learn more, you're going to read about the Lexopia. Lex meaning law, opia, honestly, I did not get a translation for, but this is one of the what we call the first or the original sumptuary law. This dates back to around 250 BC. And this was created when the Roman army was defeated by Hannibal. And there was this financial hardship in the state. So basically they were poor. The war wiped out the treasury. The Lexopia law was passed to control the spending of women. And that control to spend was targeted to move that money that women were spending on what they considered all these frivolous things, jewelry, beautiful clothing and that, and put the money back in the treasury. Once that was not an issue anymore, instead of repealing the law, lawmakers are like, well, we kind of like this. We kind of like the money going back to the treasury. So what kind of reason are we going to come up with now to keep the money flowing? So they are like, well, we want to maintain female virtue and family values. So they came up with this new reason. The Lexopia also targeted social classes. So this is kind of our first glimpse at kind of the cliche we know nowadays of the poor get poor and the rich get richer. We're trying to keep those social classes segregated. So what did the Lexopia said? And it was pretty simple, although I've read the actual law. It's why use 2 words when you can use 500? But it said women were restricted to wearing less than an ounce of gold. And that was all the gold combined in their garments, their jewelry. They couldn't wear multicolored garments. So their garments had to be pretty plain. Within 1 mile of the city, they weren't allowed to ride carriages except during religious festivals. Interestingly, it does address some other, there's some other laws that come out of this that address other parts of Roman life, not as well known as the Lexopia. I didn't go down this research rabbit hole as much because this is very, many years pre SCA period. But these laws really are the basis for our medieval sumptuary laws. Our medieval rulers and leaders looked at these laws and are like, hey, this is a great idea. This is what we can base our laws on. So we really felt these for generations in medieval Europe, the Byzantine Empire, especially 12th century on, where 12th century, we really started to see that change in government structure. So some things about sumptuary laws. There is no universal truth about sumptuary laws. The only truth is there's no universal truth. They vary from kingdom to kingdom. Even from city to city within kingdoms, we very rarely, especially early on, saw cross-referencing between neighboring kingdoms. Italy is a great example of lots of self-governing cities where they all had their own sets of laws. Different laws targeted different populations, and I'll talk about a couple of populations that we, specific populations in a little bit here. The reasons for passing laws were very vast as well. Some of them included reducing crime. So the reason they said that is with crime was that clothing was one of the most one of the largest expenditures in the household. And if somebody didn't have the money to pass the laws or to have their clothing, that they would turn to a life of crime to get the clothing, or to steal it from somebody else if they had really nice clothing. Another reason was heavily within church, moralistic. The church really played a role here, saying, luxury is a sin, and you can really get into, I was reading literally last night, in countries where we see a lot of Catholic and Protestant, we really get into, Catholics had one very strong view of luxury items where Protestants had another. And they really start to clash. So leaders had to balance that. Any questions so far? So that's kind of a basic. So I'm going to touch on a few things that sumptuary laws covered. So the first one is weddings. With weddings, some of the sumptuary laws controlled the number of guests, especially the number of women. I found it interesting as I was reading through the different sources that women really seemed, some countries really targeted women a lot. Other countries didn't target women at all. So it really depends on what countries. Weddings are also the length of the celebration was targeted, as well as we'll talk about feasts in general, or we can or the laws would talk about feasts in general, what kind of foods, the time of the banquet, so what time of day, what time of year, even what day of the week. Some cities would regulate how much wine could be served, which would, in their minds, influence the number of guests. So if I could only serve 5 barrels of wine, I don't know what that would, I could only have, 100 guests, or, I mean, that seems like probably a lot of wine. I don't know how much is in a barrel, but those are just random things off my head. They even would talk about, and these are all based on your social class. So if you were a merchant, the amount of wine you could serve would be different if you were a duke or a marquess or another member of the aristocracy planning for your daughter's wedding or your son's wedding. You could serve more, have larger weddings. Even the value of the trousseau, the dowry, the wedding gifts were all regulated by these laws, which were thought to be in turn would regulate the size of the wedding. The same with the bride's dress. And the bride's dress was, again, depending on your country, the ultimate regulator of the size of the celebration. So if the bride's dress was this much, then you could serve this much wine, have this big of a feast. You could have these many guests. You could serve these foods. So there's really there's a lot of information. And when you start to read some of the laws, I found myself going, huh? What? This, they're really interesting. So this became my research rabbit hole. Funerals is another one. This is super interesting. This one was super interesting to me because of my professional background. Very, very specific about who could wear what fabrics, which we'll see a lot when we talk about fashion. Even very specific about who walked in what order in the processional. So in the processional, there was the hearse carrying the deceased. Then would be followed by the bereaved family. Then after the bereaved family, now social status didn't matter here with the bereaved family, but then followed the crown or our royal family. Then the aristocracy, the clergy came after the aristocracy. Some countries a little bit different. Sometimes the clergy would become before the aristocracy, sometimes after. Then the military, and then the merchant class. So with funerals, a lot of times I found that the peasant class wasn't even mentioned. Clothing, Black was not introduced until later in our SCA time. White was actually more common. So if you look at some of the pictures, you'll see all white funerals. Some of the artworks. It took a long time for the lower classes, even after sumptuary laws mandated Black as our mourning color, to adopt it, even after laws took it in place. So, and generally, especially in our European countries and states where purple was a distinct color for royalty, purple was still worn by the royal family. Even if black was the main color, there was still purple involved in the, especially if they weren't the decedent's family, purple was worn during the processional. So this is a good example. This is, you know, a little bit after our time period, but Margarita Teresa of Spain in her mourning attire around 1666. So very much towards kind of, you know, that gray area we talk about in our period, well after sumptuary laws in Spain have said black is the color of mourning. If you look at, there's a famous portrait of Mary Queen of Scots with her white headdress on and her black mourning dress. And that's a more informal mourning dress, mourning. And that's where the nickname, the Mary's cap came from. So food, this one was really interesting. Lots of great books for you that are really interested in food. This is one of the things that kind of fell off. It was harder to restrict food in people's private home. So as you can see, I don't have as much on food, but, and this really, England and France were the two I found the most, but sauces were really restricted to the elite social classes in especially England. King Edward III restricted the use of sauce and taxed it so he could have money to go to war on France. So again, here we have another example of, we're trying to build up the treasury so we have a king who can go to war. France did something similar. But what we found is, and what we find in the, what I found in the literature is lower classes were trying to mimic these sauces with less expensive ingredients. Saffron was a big one. We all know, you know, saffron is really expensive. Even now it's really expensive, right? It takes like this enormous number of plants to make a very small amount of saffron. In very elite households, sauces could not be served if they were not expensive. So again, your aristocracy, your royal, you know, at your royal table, if that sauce was not expensive, if it wasn't made from expensive ingredients, you couldn't serve it. And there were punishments that came along with all of these. Working along with our food, though, is our hunting. So hunting was also restricted by social class. England, China, and France had a lot of these restrictions. England, I found in the same book that I talked about, that talked about the sauces, a big one was venison. And they talked about deer parks that were just for, they referred to the prince, but the crown, that only the crown could hunt at. And if you poached a deer from the property of the king or the crown, you could be punished, and the punishment could be severe. Question? I see a hand raised.
Yes, if I may, the topic of China, less of a question, more of, I don't quite want to necessarily say a statement, but anyway, there were at least a few Chinese dynasties where some of the really big palaces they built had like acres and acres of space for wild animals, for hunting, for leisure, for any of it. And I weep because none of them exist anymore. Anyway.
Absolutely. As do a lot of these don't, right? A lot of our palaces, and they were beautiful, right? Uh, they only exist. Um, they only exist in our beautiful paintings. It makes me sad, but thank you. That's a great comment.
I have a question, my lady, Isabella. So, in the awesome movie, Robin Hood, he's going to get killed if he poaches the king's deer. Do you know, like, what are some of the other punishments that could happen to you? Like maybe the tax for the sauce, but do you know of any of the other ones?
Um, really, it depends. If you're caught on the land without permission, you can be imprisoned and stuff. If you are caught on the land actively hunting, you could be sent off to, exile and things like that. But if you actually killed a deer, the punishment was death. So they were pretty serious, and it depended kind of on what king, and so they took it pretty seriously. They were pretty especially when you look at different like King Henry VIII was notorious um for executing people for hunting his deer. We don't you don't hear a lot about that because King Henry VIII and his 6 wives, we hear more about that, but there was a lot of other things he did. So like that. Another one with our falconry was really interesting. We think about hunting, we get into falconry, and they have all three of these countries have a hierarchy when it comes to falconry, but laws weren't quite as detailed with falconry, which I find really interesting because falconry was so important in this time period. And I'm not a falconer, so if anybody is, I'm sorry if I'm slaughtering this part, but it was really important, and using falcons in hunting was really important. So again, I found it, France, England, and then I found it interesting that China, which is, geographically so far apart, it was so important. Why did I go backwards? Wrong button. Okay. Technology. So a lot of these other things fell off as years progressed because they were harder. The food kind of fell off. Festivals they weren't as stringently. Things were more private. Things in the home were harder to enforce. Clothing was easier to enforce because everybody had to wear clothing. Clothing was very public. What and one author that is a really kind of well-known writer in this realm of archaeology and history wrote, his point was that laws didn't prohibit what they could own, they prohibited what they could wear on their bodies. So if I was a middle class merchant's wife, I could own, beautiful dress made of purple velvet with, the sable fur, but I better not wear it in public because that would be, especially if I was like English or Scottish or Spanish, that would be a dress literally for a queen. And clothing really did, after household expenses like food, heat, things like that, clothing was our next largest expense. And from our other discussions being in with even our garb, we know how expensive our garb can get, how expensive fabric can get. And I have a couple examples in when I talk about different countries on what some things can cost. So, and I mentioned, some of their rationale was, we're trying to regulate this so people don't turn to a life of crime. We're trying to regulate this. So, because we want people to know that we are this social class, and we don't want people to get confused that, this is the Duke and Duchess, and this guy is the shoe merchant. We don't want people to get confused with that. So that was some of the rationale that people had for passing these people had for passing these different laws. So I just put a couple populations in here. But this one, I found a great little video from my local library called Peasants, Serfs, and Servitude. And it talks more than just sumptuary laws, but they kind of travel through, and they're trying to get to, I think, Switzerland. But there's this little quote: "By law, what a peasant must wear must be black or gray. Nothing else is permitted. A coarse linen smock is appropriate. One pair of leather boots. That is enough." And I was like, wow, that's really, that really gives you a really good visual about what these individuals were allowed to wear. I was like, so that kind of struck me on what these peasants were allowed to, what they could wear every day. And this was their everyday clothing. Oops. Wrong way again. Gotta hit the right buttons. So peasants were restricted to natural colors most of the time. And rationale here is because it, similar to the clergy, these were signs of humility. We wanted to keep them humble. We want them to appreciate where they came from. Now, they were occasionally allowed to wear things like blue to church on the weekends. So they would have, their everyday wear for working out in the fields and that. And I found some of the artwork depicting peasants in this time frame interesting, because you see them, they're all dressed in their Sunday best, and they're in some countries, most of the time blue, occasionally green. They're dressed in these colors. Well, usually people wouldn't, work in the fields in their Sunday best, right? We really would save that for going to church. So natural colors, that these fibers would come in, organically, that we wouldn't have to dye, because dye adds another expense, right? Interesting, the Holy Roman Empire, which was the German-speaking states before it became the Holy Roman Empire, was more relaxed with its peasants, especially after it became the Holy Roman Empire. This is one of the states where we had kind of the Protestant and the Catholic. So even though it was very predominantly Catholic, hence we get the name Holy Roman Empire, it still had a large Protestant population. It was more relaxed. So peasants were allowed to wear fuller sleeves. They were allowed to, or what they called puffy sleeves, but with a, it was described as a fullness of a certain degree. But it was, as they described it, it was a judgment, but whose judgment was it? So it was very, who's to say, whoever's in power that day, right? They were allowed to wear different colors beyond the natural colors. They could get hand-me-downs from their lords and masters. They weren't allowed to wear garments that were slashed, though. So they could be a little bit nicer, but not as nice as the aristocracy. Another interesting population, and we're kind of like fruit of the earth because the rest of this is mostly about the aristocracy, is prostitutes. In the article, I do have some about courtesans as well. I'm still working on that research. But prostitutes were interesting because they took a different approach to this. So some countries, at first we took a very restrictive approach. You cannot wear this, you cannot wear that, you cannot wear this. And then when that didn't work, they took a more, okay, you can wear this, you can wear that, you can wear this. And what they were trying to do is give prostitutes a uniform. So for example, England, prostitutes had to wear a hood of ray, a striped hood, giving them a uniform. And what really the ultimate goal here with prostitutes is we were trying to moralize them. So we still had influence with the church, rules to down a moral path, taking them away from this lifestyle. So which, it was easier said than done for a lot of these individuals. So I've talked a lot about
Oh, real quick, in the chat, there was one who said the reason monks' gowns are brown is because they are only permitted to the cheapest wool, and black sheep's wool is the cheapest as it wasn't easy to dye. Sorry.
No, you are right. And I do have a yeah, and I cut that section out of the PowerPoint because like I had said in the social chat earlier, I don't think you guys want a 3-hour class. But I do have a section on the clergy in the article. Shameless plug. I'm not afraid. So I'm hoping to have the article done within another month. So, all right. So enforcement. So let's talk a little bit about enforcement. I've talked a lot about the laws. So enforcement was challenging it at its best. Some of the things that historians, archaeologists have stated is evidence is scarce, again, depending on countries. So for example, Ireland, which I'll talk about, there is not a lot of documents left. Fire, flood, those kind of things are not kind to historical documents. Some historians argue that we don't have a lot of evidence because compliance was so high. Other people argue that no, we don't have a lot of evidence because compliance was so low and lawmakers are like, we're not even going to try. So, and it really varies from country to country. We do have a little, some documents from some countries that show, yeah, we did have some enforcement. We do show some court cases. We do show some people being imprisoned for their transgressions. One of the good books, one of the best books I recommend is by Alan Hunt. He's one of the leading experts. Sorry, I can't share the cover because this is interlibrary loaned. This is in my references. Sorry, you're getting a really bad glare. Governments of the Consuming Passions, a history of sumptuary laws. And he actually gives, real life examples of cases and names and different people of their trials and stuff of like this person was convicted of this. I was reading this last night. Super interesting. So punishments though included, the first thing they did is they confiscated the garment you're not supposed to have. So going back, if I was a merchant's wife and I had that beautiful purple gown I was talking about earlier, they would take that away. Usually there were fines related to that. So in some countries, England especially, there was what we call kind of like a finder's fee. So if, as my neighbor, you kind of ratted me out or took, gave information, probably is a better way to put it, you could get money, part of that fee, those fines, up to 50% of that as a reward for being like, so that's where some people argue that compliance was so high because everybody was watching everybody. Imprisonment, especially on the pillory, was common. If you don't know what the pillory is, it's commonly what we actually call the stocks. And I didn't know this. Stocks are actually go around the ankles. Pillory is the one like our guy here on the PowerPoint. Loss of title. So if you were usually lower nobility, and I'm not good at noble titles without looking at something, but lower nobles could actually have titles taken away. This was kind of rare. And then in some countries, execution. The Ottoman Empire was one that execution was depending on your class and the severity of the sumptuary violation. So when we'll look at that, where are we at? Okay, we're good in time. So that's a little bit about enforcement, punishment, and those things. So any questions on that? So I wanted to look at a special circumstance, and this was from an article I came across in my research. So crown jewels. There are actually sumptuary laws surrounding the crown jewels. So there is great debate in crown jewels. And if anybody sat in on their majesties on their round table at last Rome, they kind of talked a little bit about this. So this is an interesting, it was kind of interesting. I was like, oh, wow, this kind of sounds like the crown jewel thing. Great debate over with actual royals. What is personal jewelry versus what belongs to the crown? Well, it sounds like listening to our king and queen, to Uller and Annalise, it's pretty clear what is theirs if they're given a gift and what belongs to the kingdom, to mid-realm, as they will pass on the crown. Crown jewels were used for a lot of things though. They were used for bartering, paying off debts, paying off for loans to other people. One thing I didn't put on there, they were used for dowries. A really famous one most people in the SCA know is Mary Tudor, Queen of France. Get my queens confused in my head. Stole a lot of her jewels from France and brought them back to England. And she used several of them to pay back her brother as a fine when she married Charles Brandon, because King Henry became very angry with them because she didn't have permission to marry Charles Brandon. Another one was Mary Queen of Scots, took many of her jewels back to Scotland with her when Francis died. Lots of instances of widowed queens, queen consorts taking their jewels back with them, and countries saying, no, wait a minute, those are supposed to be ours. So a lot of monarchies most monarchies, if not all of them now have, and still have laws, the crown jewels cannot leave the country. So there was a story this is very post-period, and I cannot remember what country it was. It was not England this time. I know most of my stories are England. I think it was Belgium. The king and queen were going to visit India and had to have a separate set of crown jewels made for an event there that could go with them, because they couldn't take their crown jewels with them because of the laws that were in place. And they do that now. They did that. Most countries did that because they needed to protect the crown jewels. There's a beautiful story about Queen Charlotte's bridal crown. And that was a personal gift to her from her king when they got married. And but the debate was, is that considered crown jewel? Because she wore that particular crown for most state events, or was that a personal gift? I tried really hard to find, talk about rabbit holes, tried really hard to find a picture of that crown, and I couldn't find one. So I thought that was, I was like, even, it's hard to be royal. All right, as promised, I'm going to talk about some specific countries with the, we have about 15 minutes left. So this is kind of a quick overview. I do have a deeper dive into the article. So any questions before we go into this? Okay. All right, first one is England. A lot of authors talk about England a lot, so let's just get England out of the way. And I try to have a good selection from across the known world for everybody. I didn't want anybody feeling, so if I missed your favorite country, I apologize. England, we see, especially with the Tudors, frequent and common sumptuary laws. We see laws before them, but the Tudors loved these. King Henry VIII passed his first sumptuary law less than a year after he took crown. In England, we frequently see the mention of color. Purple is a big one, and we'll see that kind of repeated. Purple reserved for royalty. Furs is another big one, depending on your rank, depending on what furs were available to you. Interesting with England, we go back to our Lexopia that specified women. We don't see women specifically targeted in our English laws until Elizabeth I. And we think that's because Queen Elizabeth didn't want competition from other women in court. As she got older, there's some speculation that she didn't want all these beautiful women around her outshining her. When James VI became king after Elizabeth's death, he abolished all previous laws in 1604 in England. He made a couple of sumptuary laws in England, but pretty much that was the end for England. Ireland is our next one. With Ireland, like I mentioned earlier, very few records exist, and this is because fire. In the National Archives in Ireland, there was a big fire. So anybody that's a historian, genealogist, anything in Ireland, we know there was a big fire in 1922, ripped through the National Archives in Ireland, destroyed millions of records. Plus, they like to blow things up in Ireland. So how do we approach Irish records? We have to look at records from other countries. There's a great article in, and it's in my references. We have to look at other countries. So we look a lot at what is being imported, especially from England. So remember, Ireland is still being ruled by England. So we're still trying to piece a lot of this together. We know that from the laws surviving, again, going back to King Henry VIII, a lot of the traditional Irish styles, hairstyles, and dress were prohibited in England. The Reformation of the Catholic Church also had a huge impact on Irish dress and how they were allowed to dress. So we transitioned from this, very traditional Irish dress to a more English type dress. Scotland, interesting, Scottish laws, even once James VI became king, and became James I of England, sumptuary laws remained in Scotland. They didn't have the same laws, so they remained separate. And his heirs continued, so that continued those laws. Scotland was one of the few countries that had national laws versus major city laws. So that made Scotland unique in this time frame versus a lot of our other countries. And from my personal opinion, I think one of it is because Scotland's such a much smaller, geographically smaller. Our next one is Spain, and Spain is really interesting, especially when you get to reading on it. They were very meticulous. The detail in their laws on what was banned. They describe social ranks in detail. They describe what the garment, the accessory, the detail of the garment, the color, the print, the pattern, what kind of fabric. You kind of gotta love Spain for that. They left us lots of information. In Spain, not only could you as the violator be punished, so could your descendants. So, and they're not very specific how far down the line your descendants could be punished. So that was up to the king. In Spain, this is one of the countries where we find scarlet, the color, not the wool, was reserved for royalty. So in one of the references I found, and I can't tell you which one off the top of my head, there's a really cool little clip about, I don't remember which king off the top of my head, in a scarlet raincoat, and scarlet being the color, the scarlet being reserved for royalty. It'll come to me, at like 7 o'clock tonight. Italy. Oops, I skipped a page. Sorry. I'm flipping in my notes in front of me. France. Let's talk about France. France, continued to pass sumptuary laws in early modern time. So they still pass, so post-period, they were still passing laws up until the revolutionary time. They passed about 100 laws between what we call our post-period up till the French Revolution. So they were still passing laws. So they hung on to that. They have a much more complex hierarchical state than a lot of our other states. They too focused on color as well as fabric types. And they reserved both scarlet, the color, and purple for royalty. So their laws sustained a lot longer. All right, Italy. If you research sumptuary laws, you are going to read about Italy. Italy passed somewhere around over 300 laws between 1200 and 1500. We saw a really big increase starting around 1100s, because in the 1100s periods, because we didn't have any. In Italy, the cities we had city states. So each city was making its own laws. And what we find here is we don't get cross references between the cities. So if you were traveling from one city to the other, what was legal in one city might not be legal in the next city over. So traveling could be kind of difficult. And again, this is where we find a country where there was a lot of focus on what you couldn't wear. So for example, from 1299 to 1499, the city of Florence enacted 62 separate laws. Venice 42, Bologna 21. Genoa passed the earliest law that they have found in 1157. So, and they regulated the use of things like sable, fur, and trims to the hem of garments costing over 40 soldi, which I don't know what that equates to in our money. So to make that kind of equivalent, a merchant made about 15 soldi a week. So not everybody could afford it. So, but the Italian city laws were really similar to Spanish laws in focus on the details. All right, we're almost done. The Holy Roman Empire. This is the one that, another one, if you look up Sumptuary Laws. The Holy Roman Empire passed between 3,000 and 5,000 laws between 1200 and 1500. Class distinction highly emphasized. But religion was also very, very prominent. Everything in the Holy Roman Empire was said to be better the common good. And laws were passed because they said it was to be God's will. So this had a very strong, being the Holy Roman Empire, had a very strong religious focus. All right, so Flanders is modern day Belgium-ish. Borders are slightly different. This one was interesting and I included it because they have these principles. And if I pronounce these wrong, I apologize if anybody speaks, I think it's Latin. Vivere noblement, which means living nobly. This was something the working class did. And heaven forbid you debased yourself by doing manual labor. And but lived well. By vivere noblement et decet, this was our most socially elite class, our wealthiest social class. So again, lack of consequences. Here we see more hunting regulations, and we saw a huge use of heraldic devices in the lower classes, so there had to be some regulations. Is there a question?
Let's see. There was one that said, so 40 soli is no small amount. And then this is a fascinating subject, great class. I'm curious if while you were thinking about all of this, you found that these laws affected us and carried over to into the modern day.
So that is a very good question. So I have a couple of more slides and then I will address that. Don't let me forget.
Just so you know, you've got like 2 minutes.
I've got like 2 minutes, I know. All right, so China and Japan, super similar. In China, each dynasty had a different focus. And a lot of the dynasties try to stamp out previous dynasties, especially the influence of the dynasties that came after the Mongols. And they would develop these extensive documents. China also had some super harsh punishments. Capital punishment, very common. I have a hand raised.
Yes, you do. this particular image is actually dated to the Tang Dynasty, and you could see the striped skirts here. They were actually very common and popular throughout the early part of the dynasty, but they tapered off later. One big thing that was quite commonly regulated, at least during the Tang Dynasty, because this is my focus, was the width of a sleeve and the amount of train that a woman's skirt could have. Women, there was quite a lot of focus on what they could and could not wear, and their status was tied to their husbands. So they were also expected to follow sumptuary laws. And there were a lot of them.
Yeah, and that's true of all of our countries. If women weren't specifically mentioned, you had to follow the laws of your husband, your father, whomever your male guardian was, and he was responsible for you. So just like who said, Japan, we see some really early sumptuary laws, again, focused on all aspects of life, what you could wear, what kind of dolls your children could play with, even at the cost of the hairpins your wife could wear. Again, very similar to China, some of the harshest punishments with capital punishment. The Ottoman Empire is really interesting. We have two classes here in the Ottoman Empire that are then broken down into a lot of subclasses: the ruling class and the ruled class. Punishment here again included execution.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's 3 o'clock.
Okay. So the Ottomans really targeted minorities, Jewish, Christians, and prescribed specific garments to them based on their status. So the last Ottoman sumptuary law was abolished in 1829. So to go back to answer your question, a lot of people argue that modern, like, let me stop sharing my screen. Modern, like, clothing laws, dress codes are very much considered sumptuary laws, or a type of sumptuary law. Can you guys still see me? I froze on my screen.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, that's good. I don't need to see myself. So while there's no actual formal sumptuary laws on the books, there's some really great, interesting articles out there on what modern laws are, what modern, like, dress codes are. A really good book, if you're super interested, is this one called Dress Codes. This was the book that got me going. It is by Richard Thompson Ford. He was he GQ's Man of the Year or People's Man of the Year or something? I don't remember. This is the book that got me going. This is the book that the friend made me buy. As you can see, it's well loved. So other questions really quick. I'm not going anywhere because my next class is right here. Thank you guys for coming so much. This was my very first rum class, so